Skylar Thomas here with another Maya tutorial. Today we're going to be learning how to create render passes and render layers in Mental Ray and exporting them to Photoshop as different layers to do a final composition. A lot of the tutorials I see online cover how to actually do the passes and how to do it, but they don't explain why each pass. You have to look that up separately, so I'm hoping to bridge that gap in between and give you a good foundation of why to use render passes, especially when it comes to compositing and helping a compositor in a pipeline project. And if we look at the already rendered out Photoshop composite, you can see that we have our different layers that are associated with the different passes for Mental Ray. With Maya, it gives you a default Master Beauty pass, and then that's kind of the default composite that it's already created. It's combined all the layers accordingly, and then it gives you a background layer as well, and then all your other associated passes that go with it. And here's my rough composite of it. It's just a real quick one, but with each layer it gives you control over your blending modes, your opacities. You can adjust the colors and filters, and you have a lot more control when doing compositing work than working with one layer, working with just the Master Beauty. So imagine trying to select and change all the highlights separately from the colors and separately from the shadows, and rendering into layers and different passes really helps with the compositor. And a quick rundown of the passes and kind of a main point. With the ambient occlusion, that's usually how the shadows consist of a default lighting of how they would occur naturally within themselves. Ambient occlusion are usually used for a stylized effect. It gives you really good shadow information to use in your composite. Your shadow pass, you have a shadow pass and a shadow raw pass. The difference between the two is the shadow pass gives you the shadow information based on the color of your material that you're using, or the color of your object that you're modeling. And then the shadow raw gives you the black and white grayscale information of the shadow, so there's no color associated with it. So having both those gives you a real good control over the shadow, whether it's how it's combining with the color or how it's combining without the color. And having both those just really helps. Your reflection, self-explanatory. Your reflection pass is the reflection of your materials has with your lighting. Your specular pass deals with the highlights of your objects. The different shaders that you use in Maya consist of a specularity attribute, and you can see which parts of the van here that I got on Turbo Squid have that specularity attribute, and then finally your diffuse material color gives you all your color information. And these are always really cool, I think, just because it gives you all the information without shadows or lighting affecting it. It's just the colors itself, and it's almost a cool render by itself. But now let's get into Maya and see how to set up our render layers and render passes in our scene that we have. As we open up our Maya file that we'll be working with, as you can see in this scene that I have my van, my infinity backdrop, and if I go to my perspective view, I can see my area lights that I have shining on the van to illuminate it, and that's everything contained in my composite and everything contained in my scene. But it's also, if we go back to my render cam, it's also everything contained in my render layer. And that was the one thing that was initially confusing when I was rendering in layers and passes, is what's the actual difference between the render layer and render passes. And that's essentially it. Your render layer is the geometry or lights or effect that you have in your scene that you want to single out and render by itself. It's known as the render layer, and so in my beauty layer that I essentially named it, I have my infinity backdrop, the van, and my lights. But if I go back to my master layer and create some shapes, just some polygon primitives real quick, and I select them in my outliner, select all those, and I'll create a new render layer from those. If we look at that render layer, all of those are in the scene, but my van's not, my lighting's not, just those things that I have selected were. So that essentially creates the render layer. Your render pass is what contains your shadow raw information, ambient occlusion information, specularity information, and all those passes are associated with each render layer. So essentially a composite has both render passes and render layers in it, depending on how complicated or simplistic the scene is. So we'll go back, we'll delete this layer, and we'll go back, delete those primitives we created, and we want to create basically recreate this beauty scene. We want our van geometry, our infinity backdrop, and all of our area lights, and we're going to create a new layer, a new render layer based on the selection. If we go into that, double click to rename it, we'll rename it composite. And then to set up our render passes associated with this render layer, we're going to be using Mental Ray. First, we need to make sure that Mental Ray is turned on in our plugin manager. If you scroll all the way down to Maya to Mental Ray, make sure that's loaded. And then, since we're going to be using the legacy rendering formats, we have to make sure those are available. And to do that, we'll go to Windows, Settings and Preferences, and go to Preferences. And in this menu, till down to our rendering, and we'll enable ray tracing, shadow ball swatches, show Maya legacy passes, and use legacy render settings. And we'll press save, close that out. And if we go to our render settings, we'll notice that our render layer, the composite that we want, I think there is actually an E on composite. There we go. Automatically updated. We could be reusing Mental Ray and see our common features, quality, indirect lighting, options, and passes. So for my beauty pass, I have all of these that were associated with our scene passes, we want to get rid of all those. We're going to restart, so we'll turn those, delete those. So if we make sure that we're on the right render layer, and then we want to create new render pass. And in this render pass, it gives you a list of all the different render passes that are available to use. But like I said before, the only ones that we're going to use is the shadow, shadow raw, reflections, specular, diffuse material color, and the ambient occlusion. So we'll go to ambient occlusion and make sure when selecting these to hold control to click each one. And we'll scroll down to diffuse material color. As you can see, there's a lot of different passes information that you can associate with each render layer. But like I said, we're just going to use this few: shadow raw, shadow, specular, reflection. I think that's it. With our name presets and suffixes, that's when you're dealing with Photoshop. If you go to the layers, there's no prefix or suffix associated with it, so I didn't put that. When you get into complicated renders, you want to make sure that your nomenclature is correct so it's easily identifiable. But we'll go back to Maya and we'll create and close. And you can see that the passes that we want to associate with the composite render layer are there, but we don't actually have them associated. So if we go to this button associates those to that pass. So if we go to a master layer, we can see that there's no passes associated with it. So this is where our render layer and render passes combination come into play. And go back to our composite with our associated passes here. They are there. And most importantly, to get to the render settings for each pass, if you double click, you'll see that the settings for each pass will be brought up. Some of them have different settings you can change. A lot of times it's the number of channels that deals with the alpha or your RGB channels, or your 16 to 30-bit float, whatever you're working with. For right now, we're going to leave it at the default 16-bit shadow raw. But to get to the passes attribute editor, just go up and double click in the render setting passes information, and the main one we want to change is the ambient occlusion. What I like to use is use local ambient occlusion settings. Leave it at 64. My spread I like to turn to 0.8, and then my maximum distance is 5, and I'm just doing that based on the project that I'm dealing with at the moment, and that used the best. Those were the best settings for that. You'll kind of have to trial and error to see what works best. And the best way to do that is you could do a quick render frame, and as you can see, when it renders, we won't let it render, but after it would render, if you go to File, and then load render pass, you'll be able to view each individual one in Maya itself, and you can edit. You can use your attribute editor and edit from there rather than having to batch render and open it in Photoshop. Look at the ambient occlusion pass and see if you need to change anything. But here's a quick look to see inside of Maya. But we'll go back to our passes, and we have those associated with our scene now, and with our render layer. And now we want to go in and make sure all of our options are set. For our ambient occlusion, we have to make sure in our features tab that we turn on ambient occlusion, and I want to turn on final gathering and global illumination, just so we get somewhat of a good shadow and good lighting quality. And I thought I turned the legacy sampling mode. We'll turn this up to 2. That's a really good render. We'll leave it at 0 for right now, just so time is on our side. And if we go to our common tab, we'll see that our camera that we'll be rendering from, I have that render cam already set up, and then I have just the HD 540 information associated with it. And here's a really good important attribute to look at. My file name prefix, just say van, and then your image format. We want to export this when we render it into a Photoshop layered PSD file. And when dealing with compositing, a lot of times you'll be dealing with multiple layers, multiple frames, and multiple passes. And the best one to use for when using multiple frames is the AXR file, just because so much information can be put into that image format. But with a single layer that we're learning to do, the Photoshop layered is the best. We have our render cam set up and our frame/animation extension. Since we're just doing a single frame, we just need the name and the extension, just so we have that PSD file on there. If we were doing multiple frames, we need to make sure that we have the name/number extension, and then change our start and end frame. But since we're just dealing with the single frame, we'll leave it as that. And back to our quality, we'll bump that up to 1 just to get a good render. Indirect lighting's there. Our passes are associated with our render layer. And I'm spending a lot of time on the front end work before I press render, because if you've ever rendered anything in 3D, you know that it takes a while, especially when dealing with multiple lights and shadows, and doing your ray trace and your global illumination and final gathering accuracy. When dealing with that, time is very important, especially for your job and efficiency. So if you were to spend a whole day rendering, you want to make sure that each one of those frames are going to render correctly before they render. So getting all your options set up and everything correct before you press render is a really good example, or a really good process that you need to work into your workflow. So everything I have is set, it's ready to go. So now we will close out of that, and we will go to render. batch render, and it'll ask me to save it, save the file, yes. And as you can see, it's rendering with mental array right now. I don't know, sometimes when I bring up my script editor to see how it's doing, it gives this percentage rendering done 0%. Sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't. Just be patient with it. So you have a good idea of how long or how short something will be. But while this renders, I'll pause for a minute. And now after the render is completed, go back, render completed, see the text to look at it. We'll navigate to my file. As you can see in my where I have my project set, the render layer that I have is a file itself, and that file, that render layer, contains all the passes. And what it does is when it renders, when Maya renders the layers, it'll put them initially. It'll put them in to each of these files, but then after it's completed, it'll take all that information. It's an IFF file, which is a native format for Maya, and it'll take that image data and it'll combine it into the van Photoshop file with the layers. And as you can see, we'll turn off the master beauty in the background. You see that we'll have our specular information, our shadow information, our reflection, shadow raw, ambient occlusion, and diffuse material color. And as you can see, the quality of the render, just by the settings that I had, the 540 HD, and then the sample size was not even 0, or wasn't even 1, it was 0. So the better the quality of the render, when settings that you initially create, the better image you'll have. That's fundamental. But as you can see, we'll go into the specular. Normal blending mode for specular is a screen. For shadow, since the shadow contains the color information of the shadow as well, I like to just use screen so it gets rid of all the black. And then in my reflection, do the same thing, screen. And then my shadow raw, I like to subtract it just because it's black and white data. And then my ambient occlusion pass is a good way to multiply to get all those shadows, and then your diffuse color at the bottom underneath. And then that's how you get your different render passes and render layers and bring them into Photoshop for compositing. A next tutorial that I plan on doing will be how to composite a depth pass into the pass itself. And thank you for joining me today. And until next time, I will be doing lots and lots of work